Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. One way of achieving that mission is listening to experts discuss pressing local, national, and international issues. Before COVID struck, concerned citizens met regularly to hear these experts. After COVID arrived, concerned citizens turned to Zoom, video recording talks, panels, and debates for later broadcast on this channel. Now that COVID is in remission, our main menu is again in-person meetings. But for those of you unable to join us, Village TV is video recording our in-person speakers for later broadcast on this program. In addition, when the right opportunity comes along, Concerned Citizens Presents will continue to offer the occasional remote speaker. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I belong to the committee responsible for these broadcasts. Today's program is being recorded just a week after the Supreme Court reversed Roe v. Wade. 5 of the 6 Supreme Court justices who struck down the ruling are practicing Catholics: Samuel Alito, Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, John Roberts, and Clarence Thomas. Neil Gorsuch was raised Catholic, but attends a Protestant church. Of the dissenting justices, Sonia Sotomayor was raised Catholic, but is not observant. These facts raise the possibility that the religious beliefs of Supreme Court justices affect their judicial opinions. To investigate this possibility, Concerned Citizens has invited Maura O'Neill to present the Catholic perspective on abortion. Are these justices requiring Americans to live by Catholic rules, or is there more to the story? Born and raised in New York City, Maura O'Neill spent 15 years as a sister of St. Joseph, teaching in the US and Puerto Rico. After leaving the order, she served as a campus minister at colleges in New York and California. In 1986, she began teaching religious studies at Chaffey College in Rancho Cucamonga. In 1989, she received a PhD in the philosophy of religion from the Claremont Graduate School. The author of 2 books on interreligious dialogue, Professor O'Neill retired from Chaffey in 2007. She and her husband moved to Laguna Woods in 2017. Maura will speak for about 40 minutes, after which a small number of concerned citizens are on hand to pose questions and make comments. Maura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sue. Appreciate it. I'm going to stick to my time, so I might be talking a little quickly. Now, I'm going to speak on 4 topics. And this is in response to many of the comments and questions that I did receive, and I thank you very much if you have sent them. First topic is going to be, what do we mean by the Catholic Church and its teaching, right? Sue mentioned people who are practicing Catholics. That's an interesting word in there, but let's talk about what we mean by Catholic Church. What is the Catholic teaching on abortion? Number 3, what is meant by a primacy of conscience and an informed conscience? And number 4, what is the relationship of the Catholic Church's teaching to civil law, specifically Roe versus Wade in this case? First of all, what is meant by Catholic teaching? All right, I'm going to give you a little thumbnail sketch on the history of the Catholic Church. The teachings of the Church come from those who organized the church. The first, that is called a council, all right? When all the people that are in administration in the church come together to decide what the church is teaching, it's called a council. The first one was held in 50 AD. St. Peter was giving his teachings to primarily Jewish people. So in order to become a Christian or to follow Jesus Christ at that time, you had to be circumcised and then be baptized. Well, the Jews were circumcised, so that was the way that they were administered into the community, and that's what it was. However, Paul in Asia Minor was preaching to the Gentiles. Gentiles didn't like that thing about circumcision too much. So Paul was saying, well, baptism is the most important thing to enter into the community. You don't have to be circumcised. So there was a rift. There was a problem. There was a dissension. So Paul goes to Jerusalem to meet with Peter, and they decide, okay, ultimately, no, you do not have to be circumcised in order to follow Jesus Christ. Okay, that was the first ecumenical council in 50 AD. Fast forward now to the 16th century, Augustinian priest named Martin Luther decides that he doesn't like a lot of the teachings of the church, which by the way, were not so good anyway. And he puts these 95 theses, nails them to the wall of the Wittenberg Cathedral, and raises a hullabaloo. But the big thing about Martin Luther was he believed that everybody, all Christians, should be able to read the Bible. Bible was only in Latin then, and only the priests who were educated in Latin could read it. Many of the lay people couldn't even read at all. But anyway, Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. Now, the big thing about that was chronologically, the Guggenheim Press was invented. So not only was it translated into German, into the vernacular so people could read it, but it got published, it got disseminated. So now we have a big problem because people are interpreting the Bible however they please. So, and a lot of things are happening against the teachings of the church, at least the teachings that had grown up in all of those centuries since Jerusalem. So, council was called, took place in Trento, northern Italy, and it was the Council of Trent. That date, Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563. Okay, so it combated Protestantism, which had grown a lot, which challenged a lot of things, but among one of the things it challenged was the authority of the Pope and the bishop. So what was their response? They made Catholic teaching based on authority of the Pope and the bishops. Okay, fine. So they got a little stronger there. Way fast forward now to the 19th century, and modernism took hold. So this was really very threatening to the Catholic Church, to the bishops and the Pope and the church. Modernism meant that you had to take into consideration philosophy, you had to take into consideration the subject, philosophic existentialism, the idea that the subject, the person, was responsible, and focus went from the general rule to the responsibility of persons, all of these things which threatened the church. Modernism, liberalism, oh heavens, that was terrible. So the Pope called a council in the Vatican, known as Vatican I, and he called that council in 1869. Never got closed. That council, Vatican I, never got closed. It was like continually being referred to as teachings of the church until 1960. Pope Pius XII died in 1960. And as a result, the cardinals had to come together to vote on a pope, okay? Well, the pope, they couldn't decide on a pope. They had a lot of trouble. So what they decided to do was to elect this short, fat, quiet man, Italian, named Cardinal Roncalli, who was old, late 70s. Well, to us it's not too old, but it was old to elect a pope. And so they figured when he died, that's good, we'll then know who we want to be pope. Cardinal Roncalli gets to be a pope, and because he is the 23rd person to take the name John, he becomes John the 23rd. Well, this was a major, major revolution because he decided somehow or another, he saw that all these people had been baptized and he was getting the whiff of the fact that very few people were going to church. Very few people were practicing Catholics, okay? So something had to be done. This church is outdated, he says to himself. So he says to all the bishops of the world, all the bishops, get yourselves to the Vatican. We're going to talk this out. 3 years, I will now be referring to Vatican II. It's the second council of the church that took place in the Vatican, okay? Not only did they have the bishops, everyone in the world, every country in the world had a bishop represented. When you see the pictures, you see all these pointy hats in the Sistine Chapel. It's quite interesting. But they also had theologians. What were theologians? Theologians were professional people who studied scripture, who studied the formative, the history of the church. They studied philosophy. They were advising the bishops, okay? I began my theological study in 1963, right smack in the middle of this. I can't explain to you the excitement that's going on in the church among all of us who are following this closely, that this was just amazing. We believe in a thing, doctrine of the Catholic Church is the Holy Spirit, which is kind of an inspiring, doesn't take over, it just inspires one. Well, we were praying that the Holy Spirit would inspire these bishops, and the Holy Spirit did. So that being said, I need to tell you that the documents that came out of that council are the official teachings of the Catholic Church, okay? Now, when I move on, you're going to see why this is very important. So let's talk about the what constitutes the document said that now what constitutes teaching are 3 things, not just the Pope, not just the bishops, although they're in there, but the theologians have to be considered when you make up the teachings of the church. These theologians, since the Second Vatican Council, you have Black theology, feminist theology, liberation theology, and all of them with a whole new take on what it means to be a Catholic. Also, the third thing that constitutes the teaching of the church is the consensus of the faithful, consensus fidelium. All right, what do all Catholics come to believe? And I could talk about the history of that, but that's a very, very important thing. As a result, all 3 inputs to doctrine, the clergy, the theologians, and the lay people, they input the doctrine of the church. So when you say church is teaching, it's a very complicated issue. It doesn't come from the Pope. It doesn't just come from the bishop. It comes from all those. So pre-Vatican II, before, in Vatican I, here's what the church looked like. It looked like this. There was the Pope, the bishops, the priests, then the nuns, then those peons on the bottom, which was the lay people, right? Okay. After the Second Vatican Council, the church becomes a circle. And everybody in the church has an equal responsibility in the church. Okay? Needless to say, this did not go over too well, right? We say that Pope John the 23rd opened the windows, the aggiornamento, we called it, let in the fresh air. But I said in an article I wrote in 1982 that he not only let in the fresh air, but he let in lightning and thunder and lots of bad weather. And so when I talk about the documents of Vatican II, remember that. Now let's go to the official teaching on abortion. Let's go in on that. Now let me see. Okay, I'm trying to figure out now. I'm looking at my time and I'm looking at how far I have to go. So, all right, the backlash from the clergy, things that I heard after the Second Vatican Council when I told one priest, what do you think about the documents of the Second Vatican Council? Oh, that's a failure, he said. Another priest said, I only got 1 course on it in the seminary. It's interesting to talk to somebody who lived through it. I was like stunned. It's the whole teaching of the church, 1 course in the seminary, right? The other one was, oh, the lay people, we don't want to confuse the lay people. They won't understand it. These were responses I got from priests and bishops after the Second Vatican Council. Okay, now let's talk about the official teaching on abortion. All right. What is the church's teaching? The church, now again, remember what I'm talking about when I say the church, the whole body of the people of God. That's what they're called after the Second Vatican Council. Life is sacred from womb to tomb. All right, not just in the womb. And anybody who tells you what the teaching is, it's womb to tomb. Okay, most right to lifers should more accurately be called right to birthers, ignoring the other church's teachings regarding the care for the poor, the marginalized, the imprisoned, the environment. I'm going to give you a quote from the Bible. Since I'm talking about Catholic, I can talk about the Bible. And this is a quote in the Bible that is really, really, really important to me and to everybody in regarding doctrine. Matthew 25, verses 34 to 40. The king, this is the story Jesus is telling, the king separates the sheep from the goats. He says to the sheep, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was naked, you gave me clothing. When I was sick, you took care of me. And when I was in prison, you visited me. The people righteous looks at him and said, when did we do this to you? The answer is, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of these, the least of those who are members of my family, you did it to me. Okay, really important to remember. That is the teaching of the church. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about what most people in the church who are following the documents, who are following what's going on in the world say, and I'm quoting from Joan Chittister. Joan Chittister is a Benedictine sister who has been a theologian and a teacher of theology for 50 years. She's a prolific writer, columnist in the National Catholic Reporter, which is a publication that I will be quoting also. But here's what she says, and she says it better than I can. So here we go. I do not believe that just because you're opposed to abortion, that makes you pro-life. In fact, I think in many cases, your morality is deeply lacking if all you want is a child born, but not a child fed, not a child educated, not a child housed. And why would I think that you don't? Because you don't want any tax money to go there. That's not pro-life. That's pro-birth. We need a much broader conversation on what the morality of pro-life is. Okay, so talking about teaching of the Catholic Church, womb to tomb. By the way, the tomb also means where death. Did you know that the Catholic Church is against the death penalty? All right, and people say to me, oh, but they're guilty people. I'm sorry, Matthew's gospel does not say visit me because only visit the innocent in prison. I'm sorry, yeah, only visit the innocent. It says visit those in prison. And if you study the death penalty, as we did in my ethics class when I was teaching, you come to realize it is not sacrosanct that every person that's subject to the death penalty is guilty, number one. Number two, we have no right, according to church's teaching, to take a life, okay? So moving right along. I will talk later on about this notion of zygote being a life, or so is every embryo that is fertilized, every fertilized egg a life. Let me talk, I'll leave that for a little later. Right now, to continue. Now, here's the biggie. Here's the real biggie. The Second Vatican Council put out all these documents, and one of them is the Declaration on Religious Freedom, written by John Courtney Murray, good Jesuit. And here's what it says. We have to follow our conscience, all right? Conscience has to be informed. I've just finished talking to you about what the whole teaching of right to life is about, all right? Meaning it takes into consideration after birth, right through to the death. All right. All of these other situations and teachings have to be considered when we look at what we mean by forming a conscience. We know what the church says about life beginning at conception, what happens when. Here's what the Second Vatican Council says about conscience. And I'm taking this from Catechism. This was written like 20 years ago. Richard McBrien, theologian, Catholic Church, quoting the documents of the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council Declaration on Religious Freedom declares that we are bound to follow our conscience faithfully in all our activity, and that no one is, quote, to be forced to act in a manner contrary to one's conscience, nor, on the other hand, is one to be restrained from acting in accordance with one's conscience, especially in matters religious. Moving right along. In summary, McBrien says, it is taken for granted that the church's moral teaching is normally a source for positive illumination for Christians in forming their consciences. If, however, please listen carefully, if, however, after appropriate study, reflection, and prayer, a person is convinced that his or her conscience is correct, in spite of a conflict with the moral teachings of the church, the person not only may, but must follow the dictates of conscience rather than the teachings of the church. Hear it? 1973, I'm still a nun, and I'm asked to speak to the National Organization of Women on abortion. I was doing this a long time ago. And I mentioned this. I said, you have to follow your conscience. So one woman says, why don't I hear that from the altar? Well, I don't remember what I said then, but now I'm saying, are you surprised you're not hearing this from the altar? And it's really important that bishops understand, which I think this Pope understands, but not all the bishops do, and certainly not all the priests do, that they don't dictate what is sin and not sin. They educate what an informed conscience is. That's what their role is, to educate, not dictate. And they don't understand it. And what I say to, and somewhere in my lecture notes, if you are a practicing Catholic, I'm saying this to everybody who's listening to me right now. If you are a practicing Catholic and you hear otherwise from the pulpit or any other cleric, please respectfully ask that they teach the documents of Vatican II. I would be interested in their response. And yes, you can quote my name. You can refer to me. Fine. It has been done before. Because the primacy of conscience is one of the major doctrines of the Second Vatican Council. But look at what it does to the power of the clergy. Take birth control, for example. I've seen a lot of statistics. The latest one is 91% of Catholic women practice birth control, right? This is the consensus of the faithful. You will never hear somebody say that, other than a priest who's following an pre-Vatican II document, that birth control is a sin. Okay, because 91% of Catholic women practice birth control. Not to mention that many Catholic women have abortions. Well, I'll talk about statistics later. Anyway, the other thing that I want to talk about is, now I think I have, how much time do I have, Sue? 10 minutes? Okay, I can do this in 10 minutes. Let's talk about Roe versus Wade. Okay, the Catholic Church, Vatican II, has very clear on the distinction between moral law and civil law, right? And I refer you to, if you get a chance, look YouTube. Mario Cuomo, the former governor of New York City, practicing Catholic, very good Catholic, spoke in 1984 to Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, and his speech is excellent on his distinction between his role as a practicing Catholic who believes in right to life from womb to tomb, and his role as a governor of New York. And I refer you to Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden who are practicing Catholics and major political leaders. And here's what the Second Vatican Council has to say about that. Now, let me see if I can get this whole thing. There is a difference between moral law and civil law. The former moral law governs the entire order of human conduct, personal and social. It extends even to motivations and interior acts. The latter, civil law, looks only to the public order of human society. It touches only external acts and regards only values that are formally social. In the Catholic tradition, a good law must be enforceable. Otherwise, it will be disregarded and contempt for all law is risked. But a law is only enforceable to the extent that it is based on a consensus. Now, we're talking a consensus of the whole civil body, not just of Catholics, of the whole civil body. And if one is governing the civil body, it has to be enforceable by consensus. And I don't really think that abortion is enforceable by a consensus. Obviously, there's a huge distinction. No group in a pluralistic society has the right to expect the government to impose or prohibit some act of behavior when there is no support for such action in society at large. Now, what people are saying is a Catholic doctrine with regard to no abortion, the right to birthers. You know, we've been affiliated, the Catholic Church all of a sudden in these general statements is affiliated with a very, very fundamentalist group of Christians. This is not the Catholic teaching. Catholic teaching on scripture is not fundamentalist, okay? Especially not when it talks about right to life from womb to tomb, because many of those fundamentalists do not want to support poverty. I mean, do not want to support health laws. They do not want to support affordable health care. They certainly support the death penalty. So we're talking a group of, it's not the general society, plus the fact that many, as Lynn has referred me, and I have a friend who's Muslim telling me that the other religions in their conservative camp believe that abortion, but what I've read from the conservative Jewish, conservative Muslim, who can be kind of in accord with the conservative, they're saying that abortion is okay up to a certain point. Where they differ is what that point is, but they're not doing what the Texas laws say, that you have to eliminate every single, even a miscarriage, which is just an awful thing. Speaking about the fertilized egg, this is what, you know, some Catholics think that this is what they're talking about, that, you know, the fertilized egg is possibly a person. By the way, the bishops are not in accord with what makes an embryo a person, okay? This is not, nobody is saying that you become a person, the fetus becomes a person at a particular time. They disagree with that. But let me tell you what one sister who has an MA in nursing and an MA in theology, and she was 18 years a nurse and a midwife, has to say, and I didn't know this, this is something I'm learning. First of all, 1/4 of Catholic women have had abortions, the same percentage as American women overall, which is interesting. We're talking about consensus. In nature, an estimated 50% of all fertilized eggs are lost before a woman missed menses. An exhaustive 2016 study reported that 40 to 60% of embryos are lost from the time of fertilization to birth. Such embryos are expelled during the woman's monthly menses. As of 2018, at least 29 states have fetal homicide laws that apply to the earliest stages of pregnancy: conception, fertilization, any state of gestation. Now, she asked the question, I think this is great. Will we require women to bury or baptize their menses most of which presumably contained fertilized eggs? What do these scientific findings suggest about Catholic teaching? Back to the common good. Remember, Vatican II, civil law, common good. That's the difference between civil law and moral law. Again, an article from National Catholic Reporter. If you're a Catholic and you're interested in things, this is the publication to read because it's one of the most balanced publications I've ever read on Catholicism. You might start out, the article, the name of the article is Overturning Roe Would Not Be a Pro-Life Win. Would not be a pro-life win. You might start out understandably thinking that making abortion illegal would be the obvious solution, but you would find that there is little evidence that banning abortion leads to reduced abortion rates. On the contrary, data from the World Health Organization indicates that banning abortion does not tend to lead to a noticeable decrease in abortion rates. What it does tend to do is drive abortion underground, especially in developing nations. This means that the number of abortions performed in unsafe circumstances go up. I remember Roe versus Wade, seeing the curtain clothes hangers as a pin in the lapel, symbolizing all the women that died because of bad abortions. One researcher's study indicated that abortion bans can lead to a significant increase in pregnancy-related deaths. An article recently in the Vatican newspaper quotes the Pope as saying that right to life in any stage of development, which means concern about maternal mortality rates and other health and welfare concerns. In other words, the Pope is concerned about maternal mortality rates and other health and welfare concerns. In his latest encyclical is about environment. Some critics say, what does the Pope know about science? Well, he used to be a chemistry teacher, so I think he knows a little bit about science, and he's concerned about this. So, all right, that again puts this church thing into another perspective, I think. Okay, the concluding statement I will end with here. A quote from John the 23rd. He, this little short, fat Cardinal Roncalli in the 60s, who started the Second Vatican, who started all of the things that happened. He wrote an encyclical called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. By the way, we don't have infallible statements from popes anymore. That's outdated, all right? But we have these encyclicals, which are informed teachings. Responsibilities of government, civil government, are right to life, to bodily integrity, and to the means necessary for proper development of human life. These are primarily food, clothing, shelter, rest, medical care, finally, the necessary social services. And I refer you back to Matthew chapter 25 that talks about, you fed me, you gave me drink when I was thirsty, you clothed me, you gave me shelter, you welcomed me as the stranger, and you visited me in prison. May we believe that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome comments, questions.
Well, thank you very much, Maura. I'm sure that is very thought-provoking for our audience, something new and perhaps not quite what they expected. So we have a few concerned citizens with us. I would like to, if I may, call on Barbara first, because I know her time is limited. So far as I'm concerned, if you just want to make a comment, that's okay. If you have a question for Maura, that's okay. 2 or 3 minutes per person, please. Barbara.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Maura, I just thoroughly enjoyed that. It was just eye-opening, revelatory for me, because I thought the Pope was infallible in cases of faith and morals, always, always. I didn't know that about Trent, the Council of Trent. So he just invented it there.
No, it was invented in Vatican I. No, it was.
What?
And,
Well,
and
anyway.
only on matters, only when he speaks ex cathedra, meaning from the chair. And he's only done that twice in the history of the Catholic Church, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Immaculate Conception. And you know what? The consensus of the faithful all believed it before he even pronounced it. So infallible that's all infallibility means, okay?
The nuns lied to me, but here's my quick question. So the Catholics on SCOTUS, on the Supreme Court, are actually not following Catholic teaching.
Right.
Now they claim it's constitutional civic law,
right.
So I'm still quite confused as to what's coming down from
right.
where their thinking is. So thank you. Thanks.
I think it's political. I think it's political. I don't think they really have any conception of the Second Vatican Council or Catholic teaching. And they're going, they get from the church, from there if they go to church, from the priests who are scoffing at Vatican II. I mean that, and I have to say that's why I said to any practicing Catholic that's listening to me, please ask if they are familiar with the documents. And I'd love to ask that of the Supreme Court justices. I would love to. However, anyway.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Somebody else Marilyn, Lynn, would you like to join us in a conversation? You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself.
You have to unmute yourself by touching your little microphone, and then there you go. You're good.
Is that it? Yeah. Fast learner. Maura, thank you so much. I'm just, my head is spinning. The one thing I started, I think I sent you an email reading your book, and the thing that struck me was the way you described religion as a continuum from what we would call red state to blue state, or blue state to red state. And I got interested in that concept, and I started doing research on other religions and their perception of the abortion issue. And it was striking to me that each study found the same thing, that within a religion, there's a continuum of, I would call it almost political leaning, not religion, and they say people that go to church the most are the strictest, but it becomes, to me, in my mind, a political issue. And I that's what I see happening in with the Supreme Court, is it is not an issue of religion. They're hanging on to religion to justify what is to them a political decision.
Right.
And from the point of view of a Jew, to us, that's impinging on our rights as a citizen, that you're opposing religion on our political rights. And basically what is happening is they're imposing politics on religion. And so I just, as I said, my head is spinning.
And the Vatican Council says you can't do that. Nobody can be forced to practice a religion, it says here. So you're not supposed to. So, that eliminates the power of Pope bishops, to tell us that this is a sin. By the way, somebody had asked the question about about the bishop saying that Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden can't receive communion. That's not a position of the Pope, and the Pope has made that known. Bishop McEvoy from San Diego. Did I mention this in my talk? Okay, Bishop McEvoy of San Diego.
Yes.
Said that you cannot use the Eucharist you can't politicize the Eucharist. The Eucharist is and it's also a gift. It's not something you deserve because you're a good person, so that whole thing is antiquated, and not all the bishops agree. Now, the other interesting thing, this is just a little bit of a tidbit. In order to elect a pope, you have to be raised to the position of a cardinal. Okay, so this pope, who is unique first of all, a pope appoints cardinals. So every pope appoints cardinals, and the cardinals are one that elect his predecessor, his successor. So Archbishop Gomez of LA, who is a very conservative person who would restrict communion, was overlooked. And McElroy in San Diego was made a cardinal. Now this is like big stuff, because always the Archbishop of Los Angeles is usually a cardinal, but he's not. So I just think that this is an indication of the thinking. And it's McElroy who said Cordileone, Archbishop Cordileone cannot say to Nancy Pelosi, you're excommunicated. That's bizarre. So anyway.
Well, could I ask a follow-up question there then? If that is the case, does that mean that Nancy Pelosi can now take communion in the Archdiocese of San Francisco?
I'm sure she does. I'm sure she does. Maybe she does it in, because Gregory, the Archbishop Gregory in Washington, D.C., has said you can receive communion to Biden and Pelosi.
Yes, I understand that, but here you're actually saying that a particular person was kind of sidelined for his conservative views, and a more liberal person was promoted, and that liberal person said that Nancy was eligible. And I just wonder whether that, is there any obedience here? Does that mean that his subordinate, namely the Archbishop of San Francisco, is going to retract his position? Because in some sense, the practical implications of your arguments, Maura, do matter. So it's one thing for us to say that theoretically or theologically such and such holds, but how in fact is that getting carried out in terms of practice?
Well, it all depends on your conscience. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has 5 kids, right? I mean, I don't think she's ever, obviously is not, how should I say, practicing abortion or, and the fact that her only problem, Cordileone's only problem is that she's giving scandal because she is, and I hate the statement, she's quote, pro-abortion. Nobody's pro-abortion in the right to life, all right? She might be saying people have to follow their own conscience and we don't have a right as a civil person in administration have a right to limit that. So anyway, so she's saying that, so she has in her conscience, he can't excommunicate her from the church, even though he happens to be an archbishop, but his pronouncement is not from the mouth of God, all right? Obviously not, for 2 reasons. Number one, not all the bishops or the Pope agree with him. And where there is not consensus, it doesn't hold. So she goes to Washington, D.C. and receives communion from Archbishop Gregory.
Okay, let's expand the conversation. Marcia or Joel, do you have a comment? Either of you? No?
Let Marcia go first.
As usual. Maura, thank you so much for such an intelligent analysis and information that previously was totally unknown to me about the doctrines of the church. To me, one of the most significant aspects of this is when life begins is a theological argument that a sperm has life, a fertilized egg. An egg is not a chicken. I mean, you can ponder and ponder when the soul enters and when God put the soul into the next one. It has nothing to do with the law. And the second thing I wanted to comment was your perspective on pro-birth versus pro-life and the extent to which these are the people who won't expand Medicaid, who deny benefits, who refuse to help raise wages, who do everything possible to harm and hold back the poorest among us, and yet in covering themselves with the label of pro-life, the hypocrisy is just simply unbearable.
Exactly. And this is what Joan Chittister is saying, And this is what actually the Pope has said in that statement from the Vatican newspaper, that as soon as he said life from womb to tomb, he follows it with that, exactly what you're saying. Yes. And that's the conscience. So if the conscience of a woman who is, I think it was the 75% of the people who have abortions are in poverty. So if a woman, and 61%, I read this statistics, of women that have abortions already have children. So we're talking about a woman finding herself pregnant and can't afford to feed the 3 kids she has. The husband just got laid off from work. I mean, horrible stuff coming, homeless people and so forth. And you're saying that she can't make a decision in her conscience of what to do about that, especially if it is within the first trimester, that she's not, again, when personhood is not, and the thing about a soul is not, my husband is sitting here, who used to be talking about these things himself, is a non sequitur. I mean, it doesn't actually make sense in the civil forum. And you're right, Marcia, it doesn't make sense.
Okay. I think actually Latifah's remarks would fit really well now. Latifah, would you like to unmute yourself and share some of the things you've been thinking about in this regard?
Well, I was impressed by a recent statement by the Parliament of World Religions that put out a statement in opposition to this decision. And one of the points that they were bringing up was religious pluralism is part of our whole world. And for one religious group to impose their values on all the others is against the foundation of our country. It's crazy that these guys would do this. And so the Parliament put out a statement representing the religions of the world, and a global organization in opposition to the Supreme Court's decision because of it violating the very principle of freedom of religion in our Constitution, embedded in our Constitution and in the constitutions of other countries. And I wondered if you'd seen that and if you had any comment.
I'm so glad you said that. No, I haven't seen that particular statement. I do know very much about the Parliament of World Religions, having attended one. But I'm not surprised. I'm very happy that they did. But what I would like to just add to that is that people that say that are saying the Catholics can't impose their religion. But what I'm saying is the Catholics can't impose it on the Catholics either.
Yes.
But that's violating the primacy of conscience in the Second Council.
Well, I think it's true for all the religions, not just the Catholics.
Right. But I mean, what people are saying, they're saying the Catholics on the Supreme Court are imposing their religion on everybody, the other religions. Well, they're also imposing their religious beliefs on Catholics who don't have the same religious beliefs.
Right. Okay. Joel, would you like to contribute?
Thank you. Maura, thank you for really illuminating and very well-informed talk. You've answered some of my questions, but I have one that's bothered me for a long time. I never have understood. I can understand why people might be opposed to abortion, depending on when they think the personhood exists. I can't imagine as I go being a person, and have a hard time understanding how anybody else can. But given that some do, I don't understand if Catholics are opposed to abortion, why in the world they're opposed to birth control. The only thing I can come up with is a very cynical explanation, which is that they want the world to have more Catholics. And the one follow-up question I would have is your 91% statistic about Catholics using birth control. Is that just the United States or is that worldwide? I would suspect that maybe only just in the US.
Yeah, that statistic is just from the US, but I'm not, I would, let me go back to this birth control thing. I would love to give you a course on moral theology, but I'm not going to do that in the 2 minutes I have left. But the moral teaching, which stems back from Thomas Aquinas and before, is natural law. And the teaching was that whatever God created for a purpose. Therefore, to use it for something other than its purpose is against God's law. Now, a sperm, and then this was now when they found out that, there was really both, they used to think that only the man had the power, the sperm was the only important thing. However, the woman just carried, no, really, this is why Mary could be conceived without original sin and so forth, because the sperm was what was the life. The woman was simply the carrier of the child. That's what they did believe. However, when they got to the point, they realized there were two things here, that God created a sperm to fertilize an egg. They created an egg to be fertilized by a sperm, seriously. And this was the natural law. So therefore, masturbation was wrong. Obviously, same-sex was wrong. Anything that interfered with the birth process was wrong because it was against the natural law, okay? Used to be, prior to Vatican II, primary purpose of marriage was to have children. And if you couldn't have children, you had to get a permission to get married. Now, Vatican II comes along and says, well, now we're a little more educated about life psychology, etc. So we say that there are two purposes of marriage, now equal purposes, which is a very important thing. Sanctity of the people, of the couple, and having children. Okay, so therefore, it's okay. Now, you're right, Joel, I am totally with you, and so many Catholics are with you, saying that it is contradictory, but you see that a priest cannot now say birth control is oath. My husband, who was sitting here, who used to be a priest, talks about the meeting in the Vatican on Humanae Vitae, prior to Humanae Vitae, which is the one that says birth control is wrong. And he and his fellow priest,
No.
don't put the other priest.
No.
So say that they were waiting for this to be said because they were sure that the Vatican was come out and say birth control is okay. And it didn't. Came out instead, Humanae Vitae said it was not good. So this was like a blow to everybody was expecting that it's okay to practice birth control. I, who used to be a contributor to Catholic Social Services, Catholic Relief Services, wrote and said, do you give birth control in 4 countries? They said no, so I stopped giving to them. Because I totally believe that it is contradictory. If you are going to be against abortion, and you're right, I can understand that, you have to be able to prevent an unwanted pregnancy. And by the way, going back to the moral philosophy of natural law, well, there's been a lot of other moral philosophies that supersede it. And one of them is the consequential thing, that we have to look at the consequences of our actions. And if the consequences of the actions are the death of a child, the death of a family, the death of, then you must practice birth control according to your conscience. So it really is a conundrum, a problematic. The only thing I can say is when I was teaching Catholic religion and I was teaching in parishes and people mentioned birth control, I said, you have to follow your conscience. And I would never say that there was anything wrong with it.
Joel had a second question about the statistic.
She answered that.
Yeah, 91%.
United States.
In US, is that only in the US?
Well, that's the one that I read was only.
Yes, as a US, I think that would be
Yeah,
US.
but I'm not surprised if it's similar to other countries. Now, of course, the problem comes in with the third world countries and what priests are saying. But there was this whole thing called liberation theology. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. That liberation theology was the option for the poor. And that was what was being taught by Archbishop Romero, who was killed at the altar. A lot of missionaries after the Second Vatican Council, instead of baptizing being their major issue, social justice was and still is their major issue. Well, of course, the social justice in Latin America, where they were opting for the poor instead of the oligarchy, which was contributing to the Catholic Church, all right? With these priests and nuns in 1984 in El Salvador was killed. They were killed by the governments because they were communists. They were opting for the poor. They were living with the poor. They were giving to the poor, and they were killed because they were communists. But of course, the oligarchy was killing them. And so I can't imagine that a liberation theologian would say that you can't practice birth control.
All right, well, we're practically out of time. I want to myself comment. What I've learned from this is that it would seem that the decision of the Supreme Court is not essentially a Catholic decision. I think what we're kind of hearing, and we should actually know better because as Maura pointed out, we have Mario Cuomo, we have Joe Biden, we have national political figures who support abortion. So perhaps this-
excuse me, can I correct you, please? They don't support abortion. They support the right of people to follow their conscience. Because excuse me, but I had a man say to me, well, what about the woman who has an abortion because she wants to go to Cabo for vacation? But that's the common, when you say pro-choice, that's what these people who are, think. And it's not a selfish decision that people make, okay? So anyway, go ahead, sorry.
No, I think that's right, but we have to understand that that in the course of any political goal, that propaganda is going to create stereotypes and false images in order to justify the position. But anyway, I stand corrected. Obviously, they themselves would not want to have one, but they would not forbid others from having one. So I think that the implication of your remarks to me is that we need to look a bit elsewhere as to what is this regulation about? What is this reversal about? Is it simply about abortion? Is it about something else? Is it about, as perhaps Thomas implied, is it maybe a little bit about sexual freedom? Is it a little bit about authority or hierarchy or different perceptions as to what kind of a society we should live in and what kinds of things we are free to do and which kinds of things we are not. So I think you've really widened the conversation, and that's really very important because we should all be asking what's really behind this decision and what kinds of changes might still be foisted upon us.
Mm-hmm.
So concerned citizens, thanks Maura O'Neill for explaining the implications of the Vatican II reform for abortion and is showing us that there is indeed a considerable diversity of opinion. And concerned citizens, thanks you, our audience, for joining us during this insightful program. We look forward to your joining us next time.